Does vaping cause cancer?
Hi, so my name is Leon Sharp. I'm professor of health psychology at University College London and have around 20 years of experience of working in the field of tobacco research, including most recently working on evaluating the effects of e-cigarettes, both on health outcomes, so exposure to harmful substances, but also as a tool to help people stop smoking.
I'm offering people some stuff that I hear a lot, and they're telling me whether it's true or not. And what I hear a lot is the idea that vaping causes cancer. Is that right?
I would say it's unlikely that vaping causes cancer. So we are quite confident that e-cigarettes are unlikely to be a risk factor for cancer for several reasons. The first one is, and this is one of the main reasons that cigarettes are so dangerous, is that smoking involves combustion, right? So for a cigarette, there are about 600 or so constituents in tobacco, and they're turned into over 7,000 harmful substances when you light up a cigarette. Many of which are cancer-causing. And by contrast, there's no such thing happening for e-cigarettes. There's no burning happening with e-cigarettes. The e-liquid is warmed to around 250 degrees Celsius, and vapor is produced, but no smoke, which is then inhaled. It's also important, of course, to remember that an e-liquid is relatively simple compared with tobacco as a product because it primarily contains propylene glycol, vegetable glycerin, flavorings, and nicotine. Second, because we have decades and decades of research on tobacco, we know which components in tobacco and smoke are the main culprits for causing cancer. There are over 70 cancer-causing chemicals that have been identified, and numerous studies have now looked both at the aerosol that's generated, so the vapor is generated by an e-cigarette, and also at exposure of users of e-cigarettes. And what they find consistently is that the aerosol is thought to contain only a very small fraction of these cancer-causing chemicals seen in cigarette smoke, around 1%. And when we compare exposure to these cancer-causing chemicals in users of e-cigarettes, for instance, nitrosamines or acrylonitrile, we see that there's a huge reduction in e-cigarette users compared with cigarette smokers of up to 95%. So the levels are much more comparable to somebody who's a non-smoker. And then lastly, the main substance shared by cigarettes and e-cigarettes is nicotine that people are exposed to. And many people falsely believe that nicotine, in fact, causes cancer when it is a rather innocuous substance in terms of its health impacts. It's mainly acting as a vasoconstrictor. And decades of research on nicotine replacement therapy and a specific form of smokeless tobacco called snus have shown that there is no increased risk of nicotine causing cancer if you use it long term. So altogether, I think that suggests that it's highly unlikely that e-cigarettes are cancer-causing cancer-causing substance. And to put this into more understandable terms, if we conservatively assume that exposure to cancer-causing chemicals is reduced by only 80% in e-cigarette users, that means that a smoker of 20 years would have to vape for over 100 years to experience the same risk.
That sounds really clear. It sounds like you have very little doubt that vaping just is very unlikely to cause cancer. Is that right?
That is right. I mean, the thing to put into context is, of course, most of the research in this area is based around the prior research on tobacco. So we can say with some certainty that compared with cigarettes and the kind of things that cause cancer in cigarette smoke are found in very, very low levels in e-cigarette users. So based on that, if we compare the harms of e-cigarettes with cigarette use, I'm very confident to say that it is much, much less likely that it will cause cancer. The only caveat, of course, to include there is that there may be unknown unknowns that we do not know about that could increase the risk of cancer by e-cigarette users. But so far, if you look at any kind of theoretical studies that have looked at the constituents that are found in e-cigarette liquid, it's quite clear that the levels of these potentially harmful substances much, much lower.
Okay, on the available evidence, there doesn't seem to be a risk. Well, look, I've been waiting a year to do this interview with you, Leon, and there's no way that I'm going to let it finish here. Great that the cancer risk almost disappears, but we're also worried about cardiovascular risk and respiratory risk as well from vaping. What do the studies say about those risks, heart and lung disease?
Yeah, so there are obviously also biomarkers that are associated with development of respiratory diseases or cardiovascular diseases. And the main biomarkers that we've looked at that indicate a risk there, for instance, something called acrolein, which is a respiratory irritant, also shows significant reductions compared with people who use or continue to smoke. So it's likely that the risks of cardiovascular as well as respiratory diseases is also reduced. Obviously, the main issue that people will always point out is that this is based on these biomarkers that we know are likely associated with subsequent diseases, but a lot of these diseases take a long time to develop. So until we have sufficient evidence, and I would argue that given that people have been using e-cigarettes for over a decade now, and there's no clear signal that this is happening, but still, until we have the evidence of many, many decades, we can't say with 100% certainty that these diseases aren't increased by in e-cigarette users. But everything else being equal, based on the exposure to these markers of risk of subsequent disease, given that these are significantly reduced or greatly reduced in e-cigarette users compared with smokers, I would suggest that the risk of diseases such as cancer, cardiovascular disease, and respiratory disease will be greatly reduced compared with smoking.
Now, if I've got this right, the first thing you said really quite starkly is that vaping, on the available evidence, isn't going to cause cancer. There's just very, very little risk of cancer, and that was a stark statement. You also went on to say that you get similar, but maybe slightly less dramatic reductions of risk for lung and heart disease. The important thing is to switch as much as possible. Just adding vaping into your daily smoking isn't going to cut it. You need to switch completely. You need to swap to stop.
Absolutely right. That's a very good summary, Martin.
Okay, so Leon, I'm an old bloke with a bad heart. I'm an ex-smoker with a bad heart. Vaping would probably be a bad thing for me. Is that right?
Well, if you're currently not using any nicotine-containing product, that is, if you're not a smoker and you have stopped smoking and you're concerned about your cardiovascular health, I probably wouldn't recommend you start vaping. However, if you're currently smoking, I suspect that if you switch to e-cigarettes completely, it likely reduces your risk of cardiovascular diseases. But there will be a residual risk compared with not using anything at all.
I like that. So, as a wise man once said, if the choice is between vaping and smoking, choose vaping. But if the choice is between vaping and fresh air, choose fresh air.
Absolutely right, yes. Always choose fresh air. If you're not able to choose fresh air, then please vape rather than smoke.
I think I know what the answer to this question is going to be. Professor Leon Shahab, vaping causes cancer. True or false?
False, based on the best available evidence to date. Highly unlikely to.
Okay, Leon, thank you very much.